Microsoft Endpoint Manager is a central place to manage the configuration of organizations' devices. In this video, you'll learn how to use it to manage security configurations for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. In Endpoint Manager, device configuration profiles are where you configure most Microsoft Defender for Endpoint security settings. You can also configure these settings in security baselines, but we'll have a look at that later. To create a device configuration profile, select Devices, then Configuration Profiles, and then Create Profile. Choose a profile type. There's a variety of them to choose from. Two common ones, especially for security configuration, are Device Restrictions and Endpoint Protection. Here are the Microsoft Defender antivirus settings in Device Restrictions. Configure the settings to meet your requirements. Save them, and then create the profile. After creating the profile, you'll need to assign it, much like you link group policy objects to containers in Active Directory. Select Assignments, choose the groups you want to assign it to, and done. Next, we'll look at granting access to company resources based on device compliance. Conditional access grants users access to resources, like Exchange Online or SharePoint Online, based upon their compliance with the policies you define. It's a two-step process. First, define a compliance policy. In the Endpoint Security Blade, select Device Compliance, and then create a policy. Here's an example of a compliance policy that requires BitLocker to be enabled and the threat level to be secured. Any device assigned to this policy that doesn't meet these requirements will be marked as non-compliant in Endpoint Manager. The next step is to create a conditional access policy. To do that, back in the Endpoint Security Blade, select Conditional Access and create a new policy. You can define rules, like this simple one that grants access only if the device is marked as compliant. Conditional access rules can get complicated, depending on your requirements, but the documentation is helpful. It describes several scenarios and how to configure them. I want to revisit security baselines, which I mentioned earlier. The ability to deploy your entire security configuration in a single object can save you a lot of time and frustration. To do that, select Security Baselines and then Microsoft Defender for Endpoint Baseline. Create variations of the baseline in individual profiles, depending on the requirements. In this case, I'll create my first profile and name it. By default, the profile is pre-configured with recommended settings, so I can simply get started with these settings as is and move on. Next, I'll assign my new profile and finish creating the profile. This was a lot quicker than configuring individual settings in device configuration profiles, so keep that in mind when you're managing the configuration of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. After assigning device configuration profiles, security baselines, compliance policies, and conditional access policies, you'll want to keep track of it all. For example, how do I know if my devices are compliant with a policy? I can run the device compliance report in Endpoint Manager. The data you see here is as fresh as it can be and not based on snapshots or summaries. You can also look at device compliance as a trend. This is the future of reporting in Endpoint Manager, and it's just the beginning. You'll see new reports here as they become available. Of course, you can still build your own reports. To do that, use log analytics or workbooks. Endpoint Manager is a single place for you to manage Microsoft Defender for Endpoint configurations in your organization. For more information about it, see the documentation on Microsoft Docs.